I never thought my own son would steal my life, savings, and call me a burden in the same breath. At 70 years old, I had survived immigration from Georgia in the 1980s, 35 years as a school librarian, and 12 years of widowhood. I thought I had seen the worst life could offer. But nothing prepared me for the moment. I opened my bank statement last Tuesday morning and saw zeros where my pension and savings should have been. $43,000 gone, Kristof's name on every withdrawal. When I called him crying, he said, "You're becoming a burden, Mom. I can't deal with this anymore." Then the line went dead. Can you imagine your own child doing this to you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I discovered my empty bank account, I was sitting in my kitchen in the same yellow floral nightgown I'd worn every Tuesday for the past 5 years. It was my bill-paying day, a ritual I'd maintained religiously since my husband Georgie passed in 2012. The October Atlanta sun streamed through my lace curtains, casting familiar shadows across the oak table where I'd raised Kristof, helped him with homework, and celebrated his college graduation 28 years ago. My small bungalow on Peachtree Circle had been our sanctuary since 1987, when we finally saved enough for a down payment. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the decades, with young professionals now inhabiting the craftsman homes that once housed working families like ours. But I remained, tending my garden of tomatoes and herbs, maintaining the same routines that had given structure to my immigrant life. I remember opening the envelope from First National Bank with the same careful precision I'd used for decades. My fingers, slightly arthritic but still steady, ran along the paper edge. I expected to see my usual balance of $43,812 money I'd saved through years of brown bag lunches, coupon clipping, and careful budgeting on a librarian's salary. Instead, I saw numbers that made no sense. $0.16. My hands began shaking as I reached for my reading glasses, certain I'd misread something. But the statement was clear: 17 withdrawals over 6 weeks, each one bearing Kristof's digital signature. The largest withdrawal, for $28,000, had occurred just 3 days ago, while I was visiting my neighbor Miriam, sharing tea and discussing her grandson's upcoming wedding. I called the bank immediately, my voice barely above a whisper as I spoke to a young man named Trevor who couldn't have been older than my grandson Eli. "Ma'am, these are all authorized transactions," he explained with polite indifference. "The account holder, your son, has full access as per the joint account agreement you signed in July. I remembered that day clearly now. Kristof had visited for my birthday, bringing flowers and his charming smile that had melted my heart since he was a baby. "Mom, I've been thinking about your finances," he'd said, sitting across from me at this very table. "What if something happens to you? What if you forget to pay bills or someone tries to take advantage? Let me help manage things. We'll set up a joint account for easier oversight." It had seemed so reasonable, so caring. After all, Kristof was my only child, my brilliant son who'd gone to Georgia Tech, who'd started his own technology company. Who better to trust with my financial security? "I just want to take care of you, Mom," he'd said, covering my weathered hand with his smooth one. "Like you took care of me all those years when Dad was working double shifts at the factory." I'd signed the papers that afternoon, feeling grateful for such a thoughtful son. Now, staring at the empty account, I felt something I'd never experienced in 70 years of life: complete betrayal by the person I loved most in the world. I tried calling Kristof immediately after hanging up with the bank. The phone rang once before going straight to voicemail. "You've reached Kristof. Leave a message." His voice sounded confident, successful, nothing like the desperate tone he'd carried in recent months when he'd mentioned cash flow problems with his business. "Kristof, honey, please call me back," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "There's something wrong with the bank account. All my money is gone, and I don't understand what happened. Please, call your mother." I waited by the phone for 3 hours, occasionally checking to make sure the dial tone was working. Nothing. The silence in my house felt different that day, heavier somehow. I wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects as if they might provide answers. In the living room, I stopped before the mantelpiece where our family photos created a timeline of better days. There was Kristof's high school graduation picture, his wedding photo with Layla, and my favourite, a candid shot from 1995 when Eli was born. In it, I'm holding my grandson while Kristof looks on with genuine joy in his eyes. When had that joy turned to resentment? When had I become a burden instead of his mother? That evening, I called Layla, my former daughter-in-law. Despite their divorce 2 years ago, she'd always been kind to me, allowing me to maintain a relationship with Eli and occasionally updating me on Kristof's well-being. Diana? Layla's voice carried surprise and warmth. How are you, sweetheart? I paused, unsure how to explain my situation without sounding like a confused old woman. Layla, has Kristof mentioned anything about helping me with my finances? There was a long silence. Oh, honey, she finally said, her tone shifting to something between sadness and anger. What has he done? Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an oversight. This was intentional. He took my money, didn't he? I whispered. Diana, I think you should come over. We need to talk. 20 minutes later, I sat in Layla's modern apartment in Buckhead, nursing a cup of chamomile tea while she pulled up bank statements on her laptop. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore the kind of professional attire that reminded me she'd built a successful marketing career while married to my son. This isn't the first time, she said quietly, showing me screenshots of their old joint account. 6 months before our divorce, I discovered he'd been moving money from our savings into various business ventures without telling me. When I confronted him, he accused me of not supporting his dreams. I studied the screen, seeing patterns of unauthorized transfers that mirrored what had happened to my account. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about it, Layla admitted, but you were so proud of him, and I didn't want to destroy your relationship with your only child. I also hoped that losing his family might wake him up, make him change. Has it? Layla's expression answered before her words did. Last month, he asked to borrow money for Eli's school expenses. When I refused and offered to pay the school directly instead, he became furious. He said I was controlling and didn't understand business. I felt a strange mixture of validation and heartbreak. Validation that I wasn't losing my mind or being paranoid, and heartbreak that my son had become someone I no longer recognized. What do I do now? I asked, feeling smaller than I had since arriving in America 40 years ago with 2 suitcases and a prayer. Layla reached across her glass coffee table and took my hands in hers. You fight back, she said firmly. You're not a victim, Diana. You're a survivor. You raised that boy alone while Georgie worked nights. You put him through college on a librarian's salary, and you've maintained your dignity through every challenge life has thrown at you. Don't let him take that away too. Her words stirred something inside me that I'd forgotten existed, a strength I'd relied on during my early years in America when everything was foreign and frightening. The same strength that had carried me through Georgie's cancer diagnosis and death. I drove home that night with purpose beginning to replace despair. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Miriam's porch light was still on. My neighbour of 15 years often stayed up late reading romance novels and drinking wine. Tonight, her presence felt like a beacon. I knocked on her door at nearly 10 o'clock, still wearing the same yellow nightgown I'd had on when I discovered my empty account. Miriam answered in her bathrobe, took one look at my face, and ushered me inside without questions. Honey, what's wrong? She asked, guiding me to her overstuffed sofa. I told her everything. About the joint account, the empty statement, Kristof's blocked phone, and my conversation with Layla. Miriam listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. That son of a bitch, she said, finally, her Brooklyn accent making the curse sound almost musical. Excuse my language, but that's exactly what he is. He's still my son, I said reflexively. No, Miriam said firmly. Your son died the day he chose to steal from his own mother. What you're dealing with now is a stranger who happens to share your DNA. Her words hit me like cold water, shocking but clarifying. What would you do? I asked. Miriam stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I'd make him regret the day he was born," she said, pouring us each a generous portion. "But first, I'd document everything and get myself a lawyer." As I sipped the wine, my first alcohol in months, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, deep and sharp as a knife wound. But alongside it grew something else, determination. I thought about all the students I'd helped over 35 years in the library, teaching them research skills and how to find answers to impossible questions. I thought about the budget meetings I'd attended, the grant applications I'd written, the systematic approach I'd taken to every challenge in my professional life. If I could help teenagers navigate college applications and assist teachers with curriculum research, surely I could figure out how to navigate this betrayal. "Miriam," I said, setting down my wine glass with new resolve, "will you help me fight back?" She smiled, and for the first time since opening that bank statement, I felt like I might survive this after all. The next morning, I woke before dawn, with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night of hard thinking. While the rest of Atlanta slept, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, methodically listing everything I knew about Kristof's financial manipulation. Years of organizing library resources had taught me the value of systematic documentation. I wrote down dates, amounts, and every conversation I could remember from the past few months. The pattern that emerged made my stomach sick. Kristof's visits had increased significantly since July, always accompanied by subtle mentions of my advancing age and need for professional financial management. He'd convinced me to consolidate my savings, pension payments, and small investment account into a single joint account at First National Bank. "It's just smart planning, Mom," he'd said during one visit in August. "This way, if anything happens to you, there won't be any bureaucratic delays. I can make sure all your bills get paid on time." I remembered feeling touched by his concern, especially since he'd seemed so busy with his consulting business. Kristof had always been ambitious, starting his first tech company right out of college. When that venture failed in 2018, he'd bounced between various startups and consulting gigs, always confident that the next opportunity would be his breakthrough. Now I realized his financial struggles had been more desperate than I'd understood. The joint account wasn't about protecting me, it was about accessing my nest egg dart at 8 o'clock sharp. I called First National Bank and asked to speak with the manager. After being transferred twice, I reached a woman named Patricia Chen who listened patiently as I explained my situation. "Mrs. Okalava, I understand your distress," she said with professional sympathy. "However, your son is an authorized user on this account. All transactions were technically legal under the terms of the agreement you signed, but I didn't authorize him to empty the entire account," I protested, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I thought he was going to help me manage my finances, not steal them. I can provide you with detailed transaction records," Patricia offered, "and I can remove your son's access going forward, but I cannot reverse the withdrawals that have already occurred. For that, you would need to pursue legal action. Legal action." The phrase felt foreign and intimidating. I'd never sued anyone in my life, never been involved in any legal proceedings beyond signing mortgage papers and my husband's will. The idea of taking my own son to court felt like admitting complete failure as a mother. But what choice did I have? After hanging up with the bank, I called Layla to ask for a recommendation for a lawyer. She gave me the name of an attorney who'd handled her divorce, Sarah Brennan, who specialized in family law and elder abuse cases. "Diana," Layla said carefully, "before you call her, you should know something else about Kristof. Something I didn't tell you yesterday because I was hoping it wouldn't be relevant." My heart sank. "What is it?" 3 weeks ago, he called asking if I had any jewelry or valuables he could borrow to help with a business deal. When I refused, he got angry and suggested that maybe you had some items he could use as collateral for a loan. I thought immediately of my mother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing I owned besides my house. It was a simple gold band with a small diamond, but it had been in our family for 3 generations. I'd planned to give it to Eli's future wife someday. "Did you tell him no?" I asked. "Of course." But Diana, the way he talked about it like your belongings were resources he could access, it scared me. I think he's more desperate than we realized. After ending the call with Layla, I went immediately to my bedroom and opened the small jewelry box on my dresser. My mother's ring was still there, along with my wedding band and a few pieces Georgie had given me for birthdays and anniversaries. I gathered everything valuable and drove to my bank's safety deposit box, where I stored the jewelry along with my important documents. If Kristof was desperate enough to steal my savings, I couldn't assume anything else was safe. That afternoon, I met with Sarah Brennan in her downtown Atlanta office. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and the kind of direct gaze that made me feel heard for the first time since this nightmare began. "Mrs. Okalava," she said after reviewing the bank statements I'd brought, "this is a clear case of elder financial abuse. Your son violated his fiduciary duty and used his access to your account for his own benefit, not yours." "But is it really illegal?" I asked. "The bank said all the transactions were authorized." "Authorized doesn't mean legal," Sarah explained. "When someone has power of attorney or joint account access, they have a legal obligation to act in your best interest, not their own. Taking $43,000 for personal use is theft, regardless of the technical access rights." She explained that elder financial abuse was a growing problem, with family members being the most common perpetrators. Adult children often rationalize this behavior by telling themselves they'll inherit the money anyway, or that their parents are too old to manage finances properly. "So, what can we do?" I asked. "We have several options," Sarah said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. "We can file a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. We can also report this to Adult Protective Services and potentially pursue criminal charges. The choice is yours, but I'd recommend doing both." The idea of pressing criminal charges against my own son made my chest tighten. What would that mean for Kristof? If convicted, he could face significant fines and jail time. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Georgia, taken very seriously by prosecutors. I sat in silence for several minutes, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Somewhere out there, Kristof was living his life, probably sleeping soundly in whatever home he'd bought with my money. He'd blocked my number, cut me out of his life with the casual cruelty of deleting an unwanted contact. He called me a burden. I said quietly, "What?" When I called him about the empty account, he said I was becoming a burden and he couldn't deal with it anymore. Then he hung up and blocked my number. Sarah's expression hardened. "Mrs. Okalava, you raised that man. You supported him through college, celebrated his successes, and loved him unconditionally for 42 years. If anyone is a burden in this relationship, it's not you." Her words broke something open inside me, not sadness this time, but anger. Clean, pure anger that felt almost liberating after days of confusion and self-doubt. "I want to file charges," I said. "All of them, civil and criminal." Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Good, let's get started." Over the next 2 hours, we outlined a comprehensive legal strategy. Sarah would file a civil lawsuit seeking recovery of the stolen funds plus damages. Simultaneously, we would report the case to Adult Protective Services and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Elder Abuse Unit. "This won't be easy," Sarah warned as I prepared to leave. Family members often rally around the perpetrator, especially when it's a parent pursuing charges against a child. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about this question. As I drove home through evening traffic, who would rally around Kristof? Layla had already been victimized by his financial manipulation. His few close friends had drifted away over the years as his behavior became increasingly erratic. Most of our extended family lived in Georgia, the country, not the state and we'd lost touch over the decades. The truth was, Kristof had isolated himself through his choices. And I had been his last remaining source of unconditional support. Not anymore. That evening, I called Eli to let him know what was happening. At 13, my grandson was old enough to understand the basics, and I didn't want him to be blindsided if this became public. "Grandma Diana." Eli's voice sounded surprised. I usually only called on weekends or special occasions. "Hi, sweetheart. I need to tell you something important about your father. I explained the situation as gently as possible, focusing on the facts rather than my emotions. Eli listened without interrupting, which reminded me how mature he'd become lately. You okay? He asked when I finished. Do you have enough money for food and stuff? His concern brought tears to my eyes. At 13, this boy was showing more care for my well-being than his 42-year-old father had. I'll be fine, I assured him, but things might get complicated. With your dad for a while. Good, Eli said with startling firmness. He shouldn't have done that to you. That's not how you treat family. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet house feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in my family, not in the son who'd betrayed me, but in the grandson who understood right from wrong at 13 better than his father did at 42. The next morning brought the first real test of my resolve. I was watering my tomato plants when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. Kristof stepped out wearing an expensive-looking suit I'd never seen before, his expression a mixture of anger and forced charm. "Mom," he called out, walking toward me, with the confident stride I'd once found reassuring. "We need to talk." I turned off the hose and faced him, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "I thought I was a burden you couldn't deal with anymore." His jaw tightened. "You've been talking to Layla, haven't you? And probably hired some lawyer to fill your head with nonsense." "The nonsense is in my bank statements, Kristof. $43,000 of nonsense. That money was an investment," he said, his tone shifting to the patient voice he'd once used to explain homework concepts. "I was diversifying your portfolio, moving funds into high-yield opportunities. I was going to explain everything once the returns came in." "Then explain it now," I said. "Show me these investments. Show me the paperwork." For just a moment, his confident mask slipped, and I saw something desperate underneath. "It's complicated, Mom. These aren't traditional investments. They're more like business partnerships." "Whose business?" "Kristof, yours." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he'd been caught in a lie. "Look, I've had some cash flow issues with the consulting firm. I borrowed against your account temporarily, but I'm putting it all back with interest. When? Soon, very soon. I just need you to be patient and not do anything rash like involving lawyers or reporting you for elder abuse." His face went completely white. "You didn't." "I did." Yesterday afternoon, for several seconds, we stared at each other across the garden that had once been his playground. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out his next move. "You have no idea what you've done," he said finally, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "This will destroy me. You destroyed yourself when you stole from your own mother." He turned and walked back to his car without another word. As he drove away, I noticed he didn't look back once, standing alone in my garden, surrounded by the tomatoes and herbs I'd tended all summer. I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly where I stood and what I had to do. The war for my dignity had officially begun. The first sign that my legal action was working came exactly 1 week after filing the complaint. I was sorting through 40 years of accumulated papers in my dining room, preparing documentation for Sarah Brennan, when my doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in a uniform holding an official-looking envelope. When I opened the door, he asked, "Are you Diana Okalava?" "Yes, I have a certified delivery for you." The envelope contained a frantic letter from Kristof's attorney, a development that both surprised and oddly pleased me. If he could afford a lawyer, perhaps he did have access to my money. After all, the letter was full of legal language that essentially boiled down to a request for me to reconsider this unfortunate misunderstanding before permanent damage is done to family relationships. It painted Kristof as a devoted son who had been attempting to modernize his mother's outdated financial management system and suggested that elderly confusion might be contributing to the conflict. Elderly confusion. The phrase made my hands shake with anger. I called Sarah immediately. "They're claiming I'm a confused old woman who doesn't understand what happened." I told her, "That's a common defense strategy in elder abuse cases." Sarah replied calmly, "They're hoping to paint you as an unreliable witness. It won't work, but it tells us they're taking this seriously. What do? We document everything." I want you to start keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Kristof, every financial impact you experience, and how this situation affects your daily life. The more evidence we have of your mental clarity and the real damage is caused, the stronger our case becomes. That afternoon, I bought a composition notebook from the drugstore and began what I came to think of as my truth journal. I wrote about the sleepless nights spent worrying about money, the anxiety I felt every time the phone rang, and the heartbreak of discovering that my only child saw me as nothing more than a financial resource. Writing helped clarify just how much Kristof's betrayal had affected my life beyond the stolen money. I'd stopped visiting my favorite restaurant because I couldn't afford it anymore. I'd cancelled my subscription to the gardening magazine I'd enjoyed for 15 years. Most painfully, I'd started declining invitations to church events and neighborhood gatherings because I was ashamed to admit what had happened. 3 days into my journaling practice, Miriam knocked on my door with a concerned expression and a casserole dish. "You haven't been outside in 2 days," she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. "And Mrs. Patterson said you missed the book club meeting yesterday. What's going on?" I showed her Kristof's lawyer letter and my journal entries. Miriam read everything with growing indignation, occasionally muttering curses in what I assumed was Italian. "This is exactly what he wants," she said finally. "He wants you to hide, to feel ashamed, to isolate yourself until you give up the legal fight. But what if people think I'm just a bitter old woman attacking her own son?" "Diana, look at me." Miriam's voice was firm but kind. "You are 70 years old, not dead. You are financially responsible, not confused. You are the victim of a crime, not a family dispute. Stop letting his manipulation make you question your own reality." Her words hit home, but changing my mindset wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. I'd spent my entire adult life prioritizing family harmony over personal needs. The idea of being the center of a legal battle felt foreign and uncomfortable. That evening, I forced myself to attend choir practice at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, where I'd been a member for 25 years. I sat in my usual spot in the alto section, trying to focus on the music instead of the worried glances from other choir members. After practice, our choir director, Mrs. Williams, approached me with gentle concern. "Diana, honey, is everything all right? You seem distracted lately." I'd planned to give a vague answer about being tired, but something in her motherly expression made me tell the truth. I explained the situation briefly, watching her face shift from surprise to outrage. "That boy should be ashamed of himself," she said firmly. "Honey, you know this church family will support you through this, right? If you need anything at all, you just ask." Word spread quickly through the congregation, and by Sunday morning, I found myself surrounded by more support than I'd expected. Sister Johnson brought me a bag of groceries just because. Deacon Robert slipped me his business card, explaining that his nephew was a detective who specialized in financial crimes. Even some of the younger church members approached me to share their own stories of family financial betrayal. "My cousin did something similar to my grandmother," whispered Maria Santos, a teacher in her 30s. "She felt so guilty about pressing charges, but it was the only way to protect herself and send a message to other family members that this behavior was unacceptable." The support felt overwhelming but also empowering. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel alone or crazy. I felt validated. That validation was tested 2 days later when Kristof showed up at my house again, this time with company. A well-dressed woman in her 50s stood beside him, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez," Kristof said, his tone artificially warm. "She's a geriatric specialist who helps families navigate financial and cognitive challenges in older adults." I stared at them through my screen door, understanding immediately what was happening. "I haven't invited either of you onto my property, Mrs. Okalava," Dr. Martinez said in a voice trained for dealing with difficult patients. "Your son is concerned about some recent decisions you've made that seem out of character. I'm here to offer a friendly consultation to help clarify any confusion. The only confusion is why my son thinks he can steal my money and then send a doctor to declare me incompetent when I object." Dr. Martinez exchanged a quick glance with Kristof, and I saw her reassess the situation. Whatever Kristof had told her about my mental state clearly wasn't matching what she was observing. Perhaps we could all sit down and discuss this calmly, she suggested. Perhaps you could both leave my property before I call the police, I replied, reaching for my phone. They left without further argument, but I knew this was just the beginning. Kristof was escalating his efforts to discredit me, which meant our legal case was probably stronger than his attorney had initially believed. I called Sarah immediately to report the incident. She listened with professional calm, but I could hear the anger in her voice. This is harassment, and it actually strengthens our case, she said. Kristof is demonstrating a pattern of trying to control and manipulate you, even after being caught. Stealing, I'm going to file a restraining order to prevent further intimidation. Is that really necessary, Diana? He brought a doctor to your house to try to have you declared mentally incompetent. Yes, it's necessary. The restraining order was approved within 48 hours, legally prohibiting Kristof from coming within 500 feet of my home, workplace, or church. When the sheriff's deputy served him the papers, he called Sarah's office in a rage, threatening to file countersuits for defamation and emotional distress. Let him try, Sarah told me. Every angry outburst, every threatening call, every attempt to discredit you just proves our point about his character and motivations. That week, Em brought an unexpected visitor, Eli. He rode his bike to my house on Saturday morning, arriving breathless and upset. Grandma, Dad said, I'm not allowed to see you anymore, he said, tears streaming down his face. He said you're sick and spreading lies about him. I hugged my grandson tightly, feeling another piece of my heartbreak. Kristof wasn't content too. Steal my money and damage my reputation. Now he was trying to poison my relationship with Eli. Your father is dealing with some serious problems right now, I told Eli carefully. But none of that changes how much I love you, or how proud I am of the young man you're becoming. Can I still visit you? I thought about the restraining order and the legal complications. We'll figure out a way to stay in touch that keeps everyone safe, I promised. After Eli left, I sat in my garden thinking about how completely Kristof's betrayal had disrupted every aspect of my life. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about family relationships, social connections, and my basic sense of security in the world. But sitting among my tomato plants, watching bees work among the flowers, I realized something important. Kristof could steal my savings, threaten my reputation, and try to isolate me from my grandson. But he couldn't steal my dignity unless I let him. I went inside and added a new entry to my truth journal. Day 12 post-discovery. Kristof is fighting. Dirty now, which means we're winning. I will not be intimidated into silence. My voice matters. My truth matters. And I will not let him erase 43 years of my hard work and sacrifice. For the first time since finding that empty bank statement, I felt genuinely hopeful about the outcome. The war was far from over, but I was no longer fighting alone. 2 weeks after the restraining order was served, I discovered that fighting back came with unexpected consequences. I was picking up groceries at Kroger when I overheard two women from my neighborhood talking in the next aisle. It's so sad when family members turn against each other like that, one was saying. I heard she's trying to have her own son arrested over some misunderstanding about money management. Well, you know how some older people get paranoid about their finances, the other replied. My mother-in-law went through something similar before we had to move her to assisted living. I stood frozen between the pastor and sauce, holding a jar of marinara while they discussed my life as if I were already dead. The casual dismissal of my experience as paranoia felt like a physical blow. When I got home, I called Miriam and told her what I'd overheard. She listened with characteristic bluntness before responding. Screw them, she said firmly. People gossip because their own lives are boring. Anyone who actually knows you understands that you're fighting for justice, not being paranoid. But what if everyone in the neighborhood thinks I'm just a bitter old woman? Then they're idiots, and their opinions don't matter. What matters is that you know the truth. Your lawyer knows the truth. And eventually the court will know the truth. Her confidence helped. But it didn't eliminate the isolation I felt as word of the legal battle spread through our small community. Some neighbours were supportive, like Mrs. Patterson, who brought me fresh bread and assured me that family loyalty doesn't mean accepting abuse. Others seemed to avoid me entirely, probably uncomfortable with the messiness of family conflict. The loneliness was harder to bear than I'd expected. For 70 years, I'd defined myself largely through my relationships as a daughter, wife, mother, and grandmother. Now I was learning to exist as simply Diana, independent of anyone else's approval or disapproval. That lesson became more urgent when Sarah called with an update on our case. Kristof's attorney is trying to negotiate a settlement, she told me. They're offering to return $20,000 in exchange for dropping all charges. $20,000. He stole $43,000, I know. It's an insulting offer, which tells me they're worried about going to trial. But I want you to understand what accepting would mean: no criminal charges, no public record of what he did, and you'd still be out $23,000. I thought about this as I sat in my kitchen, looking at the stack of bills I'd been struggling to pay since my account was emptied. The property tax notice alone was $2,800, due in 6 weeks. My prescription medications cost $340 per month. The heating bill would spike as winter approached. $20,000 would solve my immediate financial crisis, but it wouldn't address the deeper principle at stake. What do you think I should do? I asked Sarah. That's not my decision to make, she replied. But I will say this: if you accept this settlement, Kristof faces no consequences for his actions. He'll have learned that stealing from elderly family members results in, at worst, returning a portion of the money with no other penalties. That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in months. I called Layla and asked if I could take Eli out for dinner. We met at a quiet family restaurant where we could talk without interruption. How are you handling all this? I asked my grandson as we shared a basket of breadsticks. Eli, now almost 14 and looking more like his father every day, considered the question seriously. It's weird, he said, finally. Dad keeps saying you're confused and making things up. But you don't seem confused to me. I'm not confused, sweetheart. I'm hurt and angry, but I'm not confused. That's what I figured. He paused to sip his Coke. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. If you win this court thing, what happens to Dad? It was the question I'd been dreading. He might have to go to jail for a while. And he'll definitely have to pay back the money he took. Eli nodded. Slowly. Good, he said, surprising me with his firmness. Maybe it'll teach him not to steal from people who love him. The maturity in his response both impressed and saddened me. No child should have to learn these lessons about their parent. You okay with me pursuing this? I asked. Grandma, you taught me that when someone does something wrong, there have to be consequences. Otherwise, they just keep doing wrong things. Out of the mouths of babes. That night, I called Sarah and told her to reject the settlement offer. We're going to trial, I said. All the way, the decision brought an immediate escalation in pressure. 2 days later, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be a journalist investigating elder abuse allegations in prominent Atlanta families. The caller asked leading questions designed to make me sound confused or vindictive. Is it true that your son has been managing your finances for several months? The voice asked double quotes yes, and you're now claiming that this arrangement was unauthorized. I'm claiming that he used his access to steal my money, which is completely different from. Some sources suggest this might be a case of family miscommunication rather than actual criminal behavior. Would you agree with that assessment? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I hung up, my hand shaking. 20 minutes later, Miriam called to warn me that someone had been asking questions about me at the grocery store and post office. It's starting, she said grimly. They're trying to control the narrative before this goes to trial. Sarah confirmed my suspicions when I called her office. Kristof's legal team is likely conducting what's called opposition research, she explained. They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you or make this seem like a family dispute rather than a crime. What kind of things are they looking for? Medical records that might suggest cognitive decline, financial decisions they can paint as irrational, testimony from people who'll say you've seemed different lately. It's a standard defense strategy in elder abuse cases. The invasion of my privacy felt almost as violating as the original theft. But it also confirmed that our case was strong enough to worrying them. Support came from an unexpected source the following week. Deacon Roberts approached me after church with a business card for his nephew, Detective Marcus Johnson. Marcus specializes in financial crimes, Deacon Roberts explained. He said if you're willing to file a criminal complaint, the police department will investigate this as elder abuse. I met with Detective Johnson 2 days later at the precinct downtown. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who listened to my story with professional attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts. Mrs. Okalava, you have what appears to be a clear-cut case of elder financial abuse, he said after reviewing my documentation. The joint account setup, the pattern of withdrawals, and your son's subsequent behavior all fit the typical profile. What happens next? I'll open an official investigation, will subpoena your son's bank records, interview relevant witnesses, and build a criminal case. If the evidence supports charges, this will go to the district attorney's office for prosecution. The word prosecution felt both frightening and empowering. For the first time since this began, the system was taking my experience seriously. That weekend brought another test of my resolve. I was working in my garden when a car pulled up and a well-dressed woman in her 60s approached my gate. Mrs. Okalava, I'm Susan Beckman, Kristof's business partner. I'd never heard Kristof mention anyone by that name, but I stayed polite. What can I do for you? I wanted to personally apologize for this misunderstanding, she said with practiced concern. Kristof told me about the confusion regarding your joint account, and I think there might be a way to resolve this that works for everyone. There's no confusion. My son stole my money. Susan's expression flickered with what might have been annoyance before resuming its sympathetic mask. I understand how these financial arrangements can seem complicated to someone who isn't familiar with modern investment strategies. What Kristof was doing with your funds was actually quite sophisticated to stop, I said firmly. I was a school librarian for 35 years. I managed budgets, supervised staff, and made financial decisions every day. I am not confused, intimidated, or impressed by sophisticated investment strategies that involve stealing from elderly women. Susan tried a different approach. Mrs. Okalava, Kristof is facing some serious legal consequences because of this misunderstanding. His business, his reputation, his ability to provide for his son, everything is at risk. Is that really what you want? The question was designed to make me feel guilty, to prioritize Kristof's welfare over my own justice. 6 months ago, it might have worked. What I want, I said evenly, is for my son to face the consequences of his choices. If that damages his business and reputation, perhaps he should have considered that before committing elder abuse. Susan left without achieving whatever goal had brought her to my door. But her visit confirmed that Kristof was pulling out all the stops to avoid accountability. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the local news station and asked to speak with someone about elder abuse awareness. I want to tell my story, I told the reporter who called me back. Not to hurt my son, but to help other elderly people recognize financial abuse and know they have options. The interview aired 3 days later, sitting in my living room, looking directly into the camera. I told my story with calm dignity. I explained how the joint account had been presented as helpful financial management, how the theft had been discovered, and how difficult it had been to accept that my own son saw me as a resource rather than a person. Elder abuse often happens within families, I concluded, and the hardest part isn't the financial loss, it's accepting that someone you love and trust has betrayed you. But staying silent doesn't protect anyone. It just enables the abuse to continue. The response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from other elderly people sharing similar experiences, adult children apologizing for the behavior of their siblings, and advocacy groups thanking me for speaking out. Most importantly, Detective Johnson called. to tell me that my public statement had encouraged 3 other families to come forward with similar complaints about financial abuse. "Your courage is helping other people find their voices," he said. That night, I wrote in my truth journal, day 28 post-discovery, "I am no longer hiding or feeling ashamed. This is not a family dispute, it is a crime, and crimes deserve consequences. Regardless of who commits them, I was ready for whatever came next. The revelation that changed everything came not from lawyers or police, but from my 13-year-old grandson." 3 weeks after my television interview, Eli called me on a Saturday morning, his voice tight with anxiety. "Grandma, I need to tell you something about Dad, but I don't want to get in trouble." I was folding laundry in my bedroom, but I immediately sat down on the bed, giving him my full attention. "Sweetheart, you can tell me anything. What's wrong?" "Last night, Dad got really drunk and started talking to someone on the phone about you. He thought I was asleep, but I heard everything." My heart began racing. "What did he say?" "He said the police investigation was getting too close, and he needed to clean up the paper trail before they found the other accounts." "Other accounts?" The words hit me like ice water. Double quotes Eli. "Are you sure that's what he said?" "Yes, and Grandma, there's something else. Remember when you asked me about your jewelry a few weeks ago? Dad has been asking me questions about what valuable things you keep in the house. I thought immediately of my mother's wedding ring and the other pieces I'd moved to the safety deposit box." "What kind of questions?" "Like whether you have any gold or silver jewelry, and where you keep important papers." He made it sound like he was just curious, but after hearing that phone call after I hung up with Eli, I sat in stunned silence. For several minutes, Kristof hadn't just stolen my savings, he'd apparently opened additional accounts in my name that I didn't even know about. And he was actively planning to cover his tracks before the investigation could uncover them. I called Detective Johnson immediately, even though it was Saturday morning. He answered on the second ring. "Detective Johnson, this is Diana Okalava. I just received some information that might be important to your investigation." I relayed Eli's account of the phone conversation, watching the detective's tone shift from casual weak and friendliness to professional urgency. "Mrs. Okalava, I need you to check your credit report immediately. If your son has opened accounts in your name, they'll show up there. And I want you to call me back as soon as you've reviewed everything." I'd never checked my credit report before. It seemed like something only young people with mortgages and car loans needed to worry about. But 20 minutes later, sitting at my kitchen table with papers printed from the government website, I discovered the true scope of Kristof's betrayal. There were 3 credit cards I'd never applied for, with balances totaling $18,000, a personal loan for $25,000 from a company I'd never heard of, and most shocking of all, a second mortgage on my house for $40,000. My home, the Sanctuary, Georgie, and I had worked 30 years to pay off, was now burdened with debt I'd never authorized. The monthly payment alone was $380, money I didn't have and hadn't budgeted for. I called Detective Johnson back with shaking hands. "This is much bigger than we initially thought," he said after I read him the credit report details. "Your son didn't just steal from your bank account, he's been using your identity to create an entire shadow financial profile. This is identity theft in addition to elder abuse." "What does this mean for the case?" "It means we're looking at federal charges now, not just state-level elder abuse. Identity theft across financial institutions brings this under FBI jurisdiction." FBI, the abbreviation felt surreal applied to my quiet life in suburban Atlanta. That afternoon, Sarah Brennan came to my house for an emergency meeting. She brought with her a financial crime specialist who helped us calculate the total damage Kristof had inflicted between the emptied bank account, the unauthorized credit cards, and the second mortgage. "You're looking at approximately $126,000 in fraudulent debt and stolen assets," the specialist explained. "This transforms the case from a family dispute to organized financial fraud." I stared at the number written on the legal pad. $126,000, more than I'd earned in 3 years as a librarian. More than the value of my house. How is this possible? I asked. How could he do all this without my knowledge? Identity theft is easier than most people realize, Sarah explained. With your social security number, date of birth, and mother's maiden name information any child would have, he could apply for credit in your name. The lenders assumed you were still mentally competent and financially responsible based on your credit history. But wouldn't I have received statements or bills for these accounts? He probably used a P.O. box or his own address for all correspondence. Very common in these cases, the meeting lasted 3 hours as we documented every fraudulent account and calculated the impact on my financial situation. By the time Sarah and her colleague left, I felt both vindicated and overwhelmed. Vindicated because the scope of Kristof's crimes proved this was never about helping me manage my finances. It was systematic financial exploitation. Overwhelmed because I now faced debt payments I couldn't afford and a legal battle that would likely last months or years. That evening, Miriam found me sitting on my front porch, staring at nothing. "You look like someone who just learned the world is ending," she said, settling into the wicker chair beside me. I told her about the credit report and the additional debt. Miriam listened with growing outrage, occasionally muttering curses in languages I couldn't identify. "That little bastard," she said finally. "Pardon my French, but what kind of person does this to their own mother? I keep asking myself where I went wrong," I admitted. "How did I raise a child capable of this?" "Stop that right now," Miriam said firmly. "You didn't make him do this. You loved him, supported him, and trusted him. Those are good parenting choices, not mistakes. What he did with that trust is on him, not you." But the guilt was harder to shake than Miriam made it sound. That night, I found myself going through old photo albums, looking for signs I'd missed. Was there something in his childhood that predicted this betrayal, some moment when love turned to entitlement? In a picture from his high school graduation, Kristof stood between Georgie and me, all of us smiling broadly. He looked proud and grateful then, genuinely happy to share the moment with his parents. When had that gratitude transformed into resentment? When had I become a burden instead of his mother? The answer came from an unexpected source 2 days later. Layla called to tell me she'd been subpoenaed to testify in the criminal case, and she wanted to meet with me before giving her statement. "There's something I need to tell you about Kristof," she said when we met at a quiet coffee shop near her apartment. "Something I should have mentioned earlier, but I was hoping it wasn't relevant." "What is it?" "About 6 months before our divorce, Kristof started seeing a therapist. He told me it was for stress management, but I overheard part of a phone session once." Layla paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to share. "He was talking about feeling trapped by family obligations and resentful that he had too worrying about taking care of an aging parent while his business was struggling. The therapist asked about his relationship with you, and Kristof said." She stopped, looking pained. "What did he say?" "He said you were emotionally needy and that your financial dependence was holding him back from taking business risks. He talked about your pension and savings like they were an inheritance he was waiting to receive." The words stung, but they also brought a strange clarity. Kristof hadn't suddenly become a person capable of elder abuse. He'd been nurturing resentment toward me for years, viewing my existence as an obstacle to his financial freedom. "There's more," Layla continued. "After we separated, he mentioned several times that once you were properly situated, that was his phrase, he'd have access to resources that would solve his business problems. He was planning this for years." "I think so. The joint account, the concern about your ability to manage finances, the sudden increase in visits, it all started around the time he began having serious money problems with his consulting business. This revelation reframed everything I thought I knew about the past year. Kristof's increased attention hadn't been motivated by love or concern for my welfare. It had been a calculated campaign to position himself for financial exploitation. That afternoon, I met with Detective Johnson and an FBI agent named Lisa Chen to share Layla's information. Agent Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in white-collar crimes targeting elderly victims. "This suggests premeditation," Agent Chen explained. "If we can demonstrate that your son planned this exploitation over an extended Period. It significantly strengthens both the criminal case and your civil recovery options. What does that mean in practical terms? It means we're no longer looking at impulsive bad decisions made during a financial crisis. We're looking at deliberate, systematic elder abuse with clear intent to defraud. That carries much harsher penalties. Detective Johnson added, "We've also discovered that the business partner who visited your house last month doesn't exist. The woman who came to see you was actually an actress Kristof hired to try to convince you to drop the charges." The depth of Kristof's deception kept expanding like ripples in a pond. Every new revelation showed more planning, more manipulation, more complete disregard for my welfare. That evening, I called Eli to thank him for having the courage to share what he'd overheard. "Are you mad at me for telling on Dad?" he asked. Quietly double quotes, "Oh, sweetheart, no. You did exactly the right thing. You helped uncover the truth, and that's always the right choice, even when it's difficult. Will I have to testify in court?" "I don't know yet, but if you do, just tell the truth. About what you saw and heard, that's all anyone can ask of you." After hanging up, I realized that through all of this pain and betrayal, something beautiful had emerged. Eli was learning lessons about integrity and courage that would serve him well throughout his life. In some strange way, Kristof's crimes were teaching his son exactly what kind of person not to become. That night, I made a new entry in my truth journal, day 35 post-discovery. The scope of Kristof's betrayal is beyond anything I imagined, but I'm no longer shocked or heartbroken. I'm angry, and anger is much more useful than grief. He didn't just steal my money, he planned to steal my future, but he underestimated my strength and my willingness to fight back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely confident about the outcome. Truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply people tried to bury it. And the truth was that Kristof had committed serious crimes that deserved serious consequences. The only question now was how severe those consequences would be. The morning of Kristof's arrest, I was watering my late-season tomatoes when Detective Johnson called to give me advance notice. "We're executing the warrant at 8 a.m., he said. "I wanted you to know in case there are media reports or if Kristof tries to contact you." I thanked him and hung up, then stood in my garden watching the sunrise over Atlanta's skyline. Somewhere across the city, my son was probably eating breakfast or getting dressed for work, unaware that his freedom was about to end. The call I'd been dreading came an hour later. It was Layla, her voice tight with emotion. "Diana, Kristof called me from jail. He's been arrested, and he's not handling it well." "What did he say?" "He's furious. He kept saying this was all your fault, that you've destroyed his life. Over a misunderstanding, he wanted me to bail him out, but I told him absolutely not." I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Sad that it had come to this, relieved that the system was finally taking action. How is Eli handling this? "That's actually why I'm calling. He wants to see you, but I'm not sure if that's appropriate. Right now, I don't want him caught in the middle of this more than he already is." "Let me think about it," I said. "Maybe we could meet somewhere neutral, just for a quick visit." That afternoon, Layla brought Eli to Piedmont Park, where we sat on a bench overlooking the pond. My grandson looked older than his 14 years, carrying the weight of adult problems on his young shoulders. "Grandma, are you okay?" was the first thing he asked. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "How are you dealing with all this?" Eli threw breadcrumbs to the ducks before answering. "I feel bad for Dad, but I'm not surprised. He's been acting weird for months, always stressed about money and saying things about how unfair life is. You don't have to choose sides in this," I assured him. "Your father made his own choices, and now he has to face the consequences. That doesn't change the fact that he's still your dad, or that I'm still your grandmother. Mom says he might go to prison. That's possible. The crimes he committed are serious." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "Will you visit him if he does?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered whether I would maintain any relationship with Kristof after this was over. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "Right now, I'm focused on getting through the legal process and rebuilding my financial security. Everything else will have to wait." The local news picked up the story that evening. I watched myself being described as a 70-year-old retired librarian who discovered her son had stolen over $126,000 through a sophisticated identity theft scheme. The reporter noted that this was one of the largest elder abuse cases prosecuted in Fulton County this year. Seeing my situation described in clinical news language felt surreal. This was my life they were discussing, not an abstract crime story. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and other elderly people sharing similar experiences. Most surprisingly, I received a call from the Georgia Department of Human Services asking if I would be willing to speak at training sessions for social workers and law enforcement officers. Your case demonstrates several important aspects of elder abuse that we want our staff to better understand, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the department's elder abuse coordinator. Would you be comfortable sharing your experience to help train the people who investigate these cases? The idea of turning my painful experience into something educational appealed to me. Yes, I'd be happy to help, Sarah called 3 days after Kristof's arrest with an update on the legal proceedings. His attorney is trying to negotiate a plea deal, she told me. They're offering full restitution, plus 3 years of supervised probation in exchange for pleading guilty to reduce charges. What do you think? Honestly, I think we should push for jail time. The scope of what he did, the premeditation involved, and the fact that Yuri's elderly mother make this particularly egregious. A plea deal that includes no prison time sends the wrong message about elder abuse. But wouldn't a trial be risky? What if a jury sympathizes with him? It's possible, but I doubt it. The evidence is overwhelming, and the financial damage speaks for itself. Besides, you have an incredibly compelling story, and you tell it with dignity and clarity. That weekend, I attended a support group meeting for elder abuse survivors that Dr. Williams had recommended. Sitting in a circle with 8 other people who'd been financially exploited by family members, I realized how common this experience was. My daughter stole my credit cards and ran up $50,000 in debt, shared Margaret, a woman about my age. When I confronted her, she said I was too old to understand modern expenses. My son convinced me to give him power of attorney, then sold my house without telling me, added Robert, a quiet man in his 80s. I didn't find out until the new owners showed up at my door. Each story was different in its details, but similar in its emotional impact. The betrayal by someone trusted, the shame and confusion, the difficulty of taking legal action against family members. The hardest part, said Helen, whose nephew had emptied her retirement account, was accepting that love isn't always returned in the way we expect. I loved him unconditionally, but he saw me as a resource, not a person. Her words resonated deeply. That was exactly what Kristof had done. He'd stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a source of funding for his financial problems. When it was my turn to share, I found myself speaking with more confidence than I'd felt in months. I've learned that elder abuse thrives in silence, I said. The perpetrators count on our shame, our desire to protect family relationships, and our fear of not being believed. But speaking up isn't just about getting justice for ourselves, it's about protecting other elderly people and showing our communities that this behavior is unacceptable. The group leader, a social worker named Janet, nodded approvingly. Diana, you've identified one of the most important aspects of recovery, transforming the experience from something that happened to you into something you can use to help others. After the meeting, several group members approached me to share additional thoughts and encouragement. Margaret gave me her phone number and invited me to call if I ever needed to talk to someone who truly understood the experience. Surviving family betrayal is different from surviving betrayal by strangers, she said. The people in this room are the only ones who really know what that feels like. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I called the prosecutor handling Kristof's case and requested a meeting to discuss the plea negotiations. Assistant District Attorney Michael Thompson was a serious man in his 40s who specialized in financial crimes. He met with me in his downtown office, surrounded by case files and legal texts. Mrs. Okalava, I want you to understand that you have significant input into how we proceed with this case, he said. While the state is prosecuting the crimes, you're the victim, and your preferences matter. I want him to go to prison, I said without hesitation, not because I'm vindictive, but because what he did deserves real consequences. If he gets probation and community service, what message does that send to other people who might be considering elder abuse? I agree completely. The scope of your son's crimes and the vulnerability of the victim make this exactly the kind of case where prison time is appropriate. What are we looking at for a sentence if he's convicted at trial, given the dollar amount involved? And the federal charges, he could face up to 10 years in prison. A plea deal might reduce that to 3 to 5 years, but there would definitely be incarceration time. 3 to 5 years. My son could spend his mid-40s in prison because of choices he'd made in his early 40s. Do you think I'm being too harsh? I asked. Mrs. Okalava, your son stole over $126,000 from his 70-year-old mother through a sophisticated fraud scheme that he planned for months. He opened credit accounts in your name, took out a mortgage on your home, and then tried to discredit you when you discovered the theft. This isn't a family dispute, it's organized criminal behavior. His words confirmed what I'd come to understand through weeks of legal proceedings and support group meetings. This was never about money management or family miscommunication. It was about a man who decided his financial needs were more important than his mother's security and dignity. That night, I called Eli to let him know about my conversation with the prosecutor. I want you to understand that I'm not trying to hurt your father, I explained. But actions have consequences. And what he did was serious enough to deserve serious consequences. I understand, Grandma, and honestly, maybe going to prison will help him figure out how to be a better person. The wisdom in his response reminded me that children often see situations more clearly than adults do. Eli understood something that had taken me weeks to accept, that true love sometimes requires allowing people to face the results of their choices, even when those results are painful. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much my perspective had changed since finding that empty bank statement 7 weeks ago. I'd gone from feeling like a confused victim to feeling like an empowered advocate. The legal process was far from over, but I no longer feared the outcome. Whatever happened in court, I'd already reclaimed the most important thing Kristof had. Tried to steal my sense of self-worth and dignity. He could take my money, but he couldn't take my strength. And that strength was going to carry me through whatever came next. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, exactly 4 months after I discovered my empty bank account. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing my best navy blue dress and the pearl earrings Georgie had given me for our 25th anniversary. Sarah sat beside me, along with Detective Johnson and Agent Chen from the FBI. Across the aisle, Kristof sat with his attorney, looking thinner than I remembered and wearing an ill-fitting suit that suggested his financial resources were limited. He didn't look at me when I entered the courtroom, keeping his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The jury selection had taken 2 days, during which 12 citizens of various ages and backgrounds were chosen to decide my son's fate. Looking at their faces, I wondered what they would think when they learned that a mother was testifying against her own child in a criminal trial. Assistant District Attorney Thompson opened with a clear, methodical presentation of the evidence. He explained how Kristof had systematically gained access to my financial accounts, opened unauthorized credit lines, and stolen over $126,000 over a period of 6 months. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, Thompson told the jury. This was a calculated scheme to defraud an elderly woman who trusted her son to help manage her finances. The defendant didn't just steal money, he stole his mother's financial security and peace of mind. Kristof's attorney, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, painted a different picture in her opening statement. She portrayed Kristof as a devoted son overwhelmed by business pressures who had made regrettable but well-intentioned decisions to protect his mother's assets during a volatile economic period. My client loves his mother, Walsh argued. Every action he took was motivated by concern for her welfare, not personal gain. This is a family misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion by misplaced emotions and overzealous prosecution. I listened to her description of Kristof's actions and felt anger rise in my chest. There was nothing well-intentioned about emptying my bank account and blocking my phone calls. There was nothing protective about forging my signature on credit applications. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days with methodical precision. Bank representatives testified about the unauthorized transactions. Handwriting experts confirmed that signatures on various documents were forged. Agent Chen walked the jury through a timeline showing how Kristof had systematically accessed my accounts and opened new lines of credit. Most damaging was the testimony from Layla, who described Kristof's statements about viewing my finances as resources for his business ventures. Her account of his therapy sessions, where he described me as a financial burden, painted a picture of premeditated exploitation rather than concerned family management. He talked about my mother-in-law like she was an obstacle to his success, Layla testified. Her pension and savings weren't seen as her security, they were seen as his opportunity. Kristof's expression grew increasingly strained as witness after witness testified to the scope and intentionality of his crimes. Only once did he look in my direction, and when our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw not remorse but resentment. My testimony came on the 4th day of trial. Sarah had prepared me thoroughly, but walking to the witness stand still felt surreal. I was about to testify against my own son in open court, describing intimate details of family betrayal for 12 strangers to Judge. Thompson began with basic questions about my background, education, and work history, establishing that I was mentally competent and financially literate. Then he guided me through the events of the past year, from Kristof's initial proposal for joint account management through my discovery of the theft. Mrs. Okalava, when you signed the joint account agreement, what did you understand about your son's intended use of the account? I understood that he would help me pay bills and manage routine transactions, I answered clearly. I never authorized him to move my savings into his personal accounts or to open credit lines in my name. How did you feel when you discovered that your account had been emptied? Devastated, not just because of the financial loss, but because the person I trusted most in the world had betrayed that trust so completely. Thompson asked me to describe the impact of Kristof's actions on my daily life, and I explained how I'd had to cancel subscriptions, avoid social activities, and worrying constantly about paying basic living expenses. Beyond the financial impact, how has this affected you emotionally? I paused, looking at Kristof before answering. It's taught me that love doesn't always flow in the direction we expect. I love my son unconditionally, but he saw me as a resource rather than a person. That realization has been more painful than the money loss. The cross-examination was more challenging. Jennifer Walsh tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman who had misunderstood legitimate financial management. But I'd prepared for these questions. Mrs. Okalava, isn't it true that you asked your son to help you with your finances because you were concerned about your ability to manage them independently? No, that's not accurate. I asked him to help me organize my accounts for convenience, not because I was unable to manage them myself. But you're 70 years old. Surely you must have some concerns about cognitive decline. I'm 70 years old, not dead, I replied firmly. My mind is as sharp as it was when I was managing library budgets and supervising staff. Age doesn't automatically equal incompetence. Walsh tried several more approaches to suggest that I was either confused or vindictive, but each attempt felt weaker than the last. The evidence was simply too clear for reasonable people to dismiss. The defense case lasted only 1 day. Kristof's business associates testified about his financial pressures and described him as someone who cared deeply about family obligations. A character witness from his college days spoke about his integrity and intelligence, but none of them could explain away the forged signatures, the unauthorized accounts, or the blocked phone calls when I tried to reach him after discovering the theft. Kristof himself chose not to testify, which Sarah had predicted would happen. If he takes the stand, the prosecutor can ask about every detail of what he did, she'd explained. Given the evidence, there's no version of his story that doesn't make him look worse. The closing arguments brought the case's central themes into sharp focus. Thompson emphasized the vulnerability of elderly victims and the particular cruelty of family financial abuse. The defendant didn't steal from a stranger, he told the jury. He stole from the woman who raised him, sacrificed for him, and trusted him with her financial security. He betrayed the most fundamental bond in human society, the bond between parent and child. Walsh made a final effort to frame the case as a misunderstanding, arguing that Kristof had genuinely believed he was protecting my assets and that the family crisis could be resolved through restitution rather than imprisonment. Prison won't help anyone here, she concluded. What this family needs is healing, not punishment. But her words fell hollow against the weight of evidence that had been presented. This wasn't a family crisis, it was a crime that happened to involve family members. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. As the foreman stood to announce their decision, I felt my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. On the charge of elder abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. Kristof's shoulders sagged as each guilty verdict was read. His attorney placed a supportive hand on his arm, but he seemed to deflate with each pronouncement. I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. Relief that the system had worked, and my experience had been validated. Sadness that it had come to this point. Vindication that speaking up had been the right choice. After the jury was dismissed, Thompson approached me with a satisfied expression. Justice was served today. Mrs. Okalava, your courage in pursuing this case has sent a clear message that elder abuse will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. As I left the courthouse that afternoon, I was surprised to find a small group of supporters waiting for me. Miriam was there, along with several members of my church, 2 women from the elder abuse support group, and even Mrs. Patterson from my neighborhood. We're proud of you, Miriam said, giving me a fierce hug. You stood up not just for yourself, but for every elderly person who's been taken advantage of by family members. That evening, I called Eli to let him know about the verdict. He listened quietly as I explained what had happened. How long will Dad be in prison? He asked. The sentencing hearing is next month. It could be anywhere from 3 to 7 years. Are you sad about it? Yes and no, I answered honestly. I'm sad that your father made choices that led to this outcome. But I'm not sad that there are consequences for what he did. Maybe prison will give him time to think about the kind of person he wants to be when he gets out. Will you visit him? I don't know yet. That's something I'll have to decide after sentencing. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how much my life had changed since discovering that empty bank statement 5 months ago. I'd gone from feeling like a victim to feeling like a survivor, from being isolated by shame to being connected to a community of people who understood my experience. The trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. Tomorrow, I would start the process of clearing the fraudulent debt from my credit report and working with Sarah to recover as much of the stolen money as possible. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. I'd fought for justice and won. I'd refused to be silenced by shame or intimidated by family pressure. I'd proven that elderly voices matter and that crimes against vulnerable people have consequences. Kristof had tried to steal my dignity along with my money. But dignity, I'd learned, can't be stolen, it can only be surrendered, and I'd refused to surrender mine. 6 weeks after the trial ended, I stood in the kitchen of my small bungalow, preparing dinner for an unexpected gathering. Miriam was setting the table while Layla arranged flowers in the crystal vase that had somehow survived all the upheaval of the past year. Eli sat at the counter doing homework, occasionally looking up to ask questions about algebra that reminded me of helping Kristof with similar problems 30 years ago. The occasion was simple, but meaningful. I was hosting my first dinner party since before Georgie's death. For 12 years, I'd declined invitations and avoided entertaining, convincing myself that social gatherings were for couples, not widows. But something about surviving Kristof's betrayal had awakened a desire for connection and community that I'd forgotten I possessed. Grandma, this polynomial equation doesn't make sense, Eli said, erasing his work for the 3rd time. Let me see, I said, looking over his shoulder. The math came back to me easily. muscle memory from decades of helping students with research projects that required statistical analysis. You're making it more complicated than it needs to be. Break it down into smaller parts. As I guided him through the problem, I marveled at how natural it felt to be teaching again. The trial and its aftermath had consumed so much emotional energy that I'd forgotten simple pleasures like helping a young person learn something new. The sentencing hearing had taken place 3 weeks after the verdict. Kristof received 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, and an order to pay full restitution of $126,000 plus interest. Judge Patricia Martinez had been particularly stern in her comments. Elder abuse strikes at the foundation of family trust, she'd said before pronouncing sentence. When adult children exploit their aging parents, they don't just commit financial crimes, they violate the most basic principles of human decency. Mr. Okalava, your mother spent 70 years building the financial security you destroyed in 6 months. Your actions warrant significant punishment. Kristof had finally looked at me during the sentencing, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been remorse in his expression. But he'd said nothing, not even. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, I still didn't know if I would visit him in prison. The idea felt both emotionally complex and practically challenging. Part of me wanted to maintain some connection to the child I'd raised with such love and hope. Another part of me recognized that the person who'd committed these crimes was no longer the son I remembered. Mrs. Okalava. Detective Johnson's voice interrupted my thoughts. He'd arrived early for dinner, bringing his wife, Martha, a retired teacher who'd expressed interest in hearing my story after following the case in the news. Please, call me Diana, I said, taking their coats. We're well past formalities at this point. Detective Johnson Marcus had become something more than a professional contact during the investigation and trial. His genuine concern for elderly victims and his patient explanations of legal procedures had made him feel like family. Martha brought wine, he said, holding up a bottle. She insisted on contributing something to celebrate your new beginning. Martha was a warm woman in her 50s with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd spent decades managing teenagers. Marcus told me about your plans to speak at training seminars, she said. I think it's wonderful that you're turning such a difficult experience into something educational. The speaking engagements had begun 2 weeks after the trial ended. Dr. Williams from the Department of Human Services had connected me with organizations across Georgia that train social workers, police officers, and healthcare workers to recognize elder abuse. My first presentation had been terrifying, standing before 30 professionals and describing the most painful experience of my life, but the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Your story puts a human face on statistics, one social worker had told me afterward. When we see elder abuse reports in the field, we'll remember your experience and treat each case with the seriousness it deserves. Since then, I'd spoken at 6 different training sessions, each one feeling slightly easier than the last. The speaking fees weren't large, but they provided a modest income stream that helped supplement my reduced savings while the restitution process worked its way through the legal system. More importantly, the speaking engagements had given me a sense of purpose that I'd been missing since retirement. After 35 years of helping students navigate research challenges and life questions, I'd struggled to find meaningful ways to use my skills and experience. Now I was helping professionals better serve vulnerable populations, which felt like a natural extension of my librarian's instinct to connect people with the information they needed. Diana, this smells incredible, Layla said, checking the pot roast I'd been cooking all afternoon. What's your secret? Time and patience, I replied. The same ingredients that solve most problems in life. It was a lesson I'd learned through painful experience over the past year. The legal process had taken months longer than I'd expected, requiring patience with bureaucratic delays and faith that justice would eventually prevail. The emotional healing had taken even longer, requiring time to process not just the financial betrayal, but the deeper wounds of family trust broken. Sarah Brennan arrived just as I was pulling dinner rolls from the oven. She'd become more than my attorney during the case, developing into something approaching friendship. Tonight she brought her partner Jennifer, a professor of social work at Emory University who'd been following my case with professional interest. "How's the restitution process coming along?" Sarah asked as we gathered around the dining room table. "Slowly but steadily," I replied. "The government seized Kristof's remaining assets, including his car and some business equipment they recovered. About $30,000 so far, which isn't much compared to what he stole, but it's something. What about the credit accounts he opened in your name?" "Those are being cleared from my credit report one by one. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. But the FBI Victim Services Coordinator has been helpful in navigating the process." The conversation flowed easily as we shared the meal I'd prepared with such care. Around this table, I felt surrounded by people who understood my journey and respected the choices I'd made. It was a sharp contrast to the isolation I'd felt during the darkest days of the legal battle. "Grandma, tell them about the article," Eli prompted between bites of pot roast. I'd almost forgotten about the magazine piece. A writer from AAP Bulletin had contacted me after hearing about my case, wanting to include my story in an article about family financial abuse. The piece had been published the previous month with my photograph and a detailed account of Kristof's crimes. "The response has been overwhelming," I admitted. "I've received over 100 letters from people sharing similar experiences or thanking me for speaking up. Some of them are heartbreaking elderly people who've been financially abused, but are too ashamed or afraid to take action." "Are you responding to all of them?" Martha asked. "I try to. Many of these people just need someone to validate their experience and assure them that they're not crazy or vindictive for feeling betrayed." Jennifer, Sarah's partner, leaned forward with interest. "Have you considered writing a book about your experience? There's clearly a need for this kind of first-person account of elder abuse recovery." The suggestion caught me off guard. "I'm not a writer, I'm a retired librarian." "Librarians are excellent researchers and organizers of information," Jennifer pointed out. "And you have a compelling story that could help thousands of people." The idea intrigued me, but it also felt overwhelming. Writing a book seemed like such an enormous undertaking for someone who'd never published anything more complex than library newsletter articles. "Think about it," Sarah suggested. "You could collaborate with a professional writer or work with a publisher who specializes in memoirs. The important thing would be getting your story out there in a format that reaches the widest possible audience." As dinner wound down and we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, I found myself looking around at the faces of my guests and feeling grateful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not just grateful for their support during the legal battle, but grateful for the relationships that had emerged from that terrible experience. Marcus and Martha had become genuine friends, often inviting me to community events and including me in their social circle. Sarah and Jennifer had introduced me to other advocates and activists working on elder rights issues. Even my relationship with Layla had deepened, evolving from polite courtesy to authentic friendship based on shared experience of Kristof's manipulation. "I have something to announce," I said as Miriam served her famous tiramisu. "I've decided to sell this house." The room fell silent for a moment. This bungalow had been my home for 37 years, the place where I'd raised Kristof and created a life with Georgie. "Are you sure?" Layla asked gently. "This house has so many memories." "That's exactly the problem," I replied. "Too many of the recent memories are painful. Every room reminds me of Kristof's visits last year, when he was planning how to steal from me while pretending to care about my welfare." I'd been thinking about this decision for weeks, ever since the restitution payments had made it clear that my financial recovery would be slow and uncertain. The house was worth about $180,000. And even after paying off the fraudulent second mortgage Kristof had taken out, I'd have enough money to buy a smaller place and rebuild my savings. "Where will you move to?" Eli asked, looking worried. "I'm looking at a townhouse in a senior community about 15 minutes from here. It's smaller, but much easier to maintain, and there are activities and social opportunities I think I'd enjoy." The community I'd been visiting offered everything from book clubs to gardening groups to volunteer opportunities. After years of isolation and months of legal stress, the idea of being surrounded by active, engaged people my own age felt appealing. Plus, I added, the sale proceeds will give me financial independence again. I won't have to worry about whether the restitution payments will be enough to cover my basic expenses. Marcus nodded approvingly. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what you need after a traumatic experience. As my guests prepared to leave that evening, each of them hugged me with genuine warmth and made plans for future gatherings. Watching them drive away, I felt more connected to community than I had in years. The next morning, I called my realtor to list the house officially. As I walked through each room, imagining how it might look to potential buyers, I realized that selling wasn't really about escaping painful memories. It was about choosing to create new ones. In the kitchen where I discovered Kristof's theft, I saw possibilities for a smaller, more efficient space where I could cook for friends without feeling overwhelmed by unused square footage. In the living room where we'd argued about the joint account, I imagined a cozier arrangement that would encourage conversation and connection. The garden would be harder to leave, but I'd already started plans for container gardening on the townhouses. Small patio, some of my favorite plants could make the move with me, carrying the best parts of this place into whatever came next. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and began writing what Jennifer had suggested might become a book. I started with a simple sentence. I never thought my own son would steal my life, savings, and call me a burden in the same breath. The words flowed more easily than I'd expected, perhaps because I'd been telling this story in various forms for months to police officers, lawyers, juries, and training seminar audiences. But writing it down felt different, more permanent and reflective. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I found myself crafting not just a chronological account of events, but a deeper exploration of what it means to reclaim dignity after betrayal, to find strength in unexpected places, and to transform victimhood into advocacy. By the time I stopped writing, I had nearly 10 pages of draft material and a clear sense that this project could become something meaningful, not just for other elder abuse survivors, but for anyone who'd ever struggled to find their voice after being silenced by shame or fear. The house sold 3 weeks later to a young couple expecting their first child. As I signed the closing papers, I thought about the cycles of life that had played out within those walls. Kristof learning to walk in the living room, family dinners around the kitchen table, quiet evenings with Georgie on the front porch. Now new families would create new memories in those spaces. Just as I was preparing to create new memories in a different place, moving day arrived on a bright Saturday in May, exactly 1 year after I discovered my empty bank account. As I watched the movers load my furniture into their truck, I felt not sadness, but anticipation for whatever came next. I helped me pack the last of my personal items, carefully wrapping the crystal vase and the family photos that would accompany me to my new home. Are you excited, Grandma? He asked as we worked together. I am, I realized with some surprise. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of running away from something. The townhouse was everything I'd hoped. 4 bright, manageable, and situated in a community where my neighbors were interested in books, gardening, and civic engagement. Within a week of moving in, I joined the book club, volunteered to help with the community newsletter, and started planning a herb garden for my small patio. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder abuse prevention in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of 500 professionals and advocates, I told my story with confidence and clarity that would have been unimaginable during those dark days of the legal battle. Elder abuse thrives in silence and shame, I concluded. But when we find the courage to speak our truth, we not only protect ourselves, we protect every vulnerable person who might face similar exploitation. Our voices matter, our experiences matter, and we have the power to demand better from our families, our communities, and our justice system. The standing ovation that followed felt like validation not just of my individual journey, but of every choice I'd made to fight back against Kristof's betrayal. I'd transformed the worst experience of my life into a platform for helping others, and that transformation felt like the truest victory of all. That evening, sitting in my hotel room overlooking the nation's capital, I called Eli to share the day's experience. I'm proud of you, Grandma, he said. You turned something terrible into something important. His words captured exactly what I'd been trying to accomplish over the past year and a half. I hadn't just survived Kristof's crimes, I'd used them as motivation to become a stronger, more purposeful version of myself. The book was published the following spring to positive reviews and strong sales within the elder advocacy community. Reading my own story in print felt surreal, but the response from readers confirmed that sharing these experiences had value beyond my personal healing. Your book helped me find the courage to report my daughter for financial abuse, one reader wrote. I thought I was alone and crazy, but your story showed me that this happens to good people and that fighting back is the right choice. 2 years after discovering my empty bank account, I received an unexpected letter forwarded from my publisher. The return address showed it was from the federal prison where Kristof was serving his sentence. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, unsure whether I was ready for whatever message it contained. The letter was brief and carefully worded. Mom, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just want you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and it wasn't just money. I'm working with a counselor here to understand how I became someone capable of hurting you like that. I don't expect a response, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry and that I'm proud of how you fought back. I'm proud of the person you've always been and sorry it took losing everything for me to remember that. Love, Kristof. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and putting it in the drawer with other important papers. I wasn't ready to forgive him, and I might never be. But the letter suggested that prison had given him time to think about the person he wanted to be when he was released. Whether he would become that person remained to be seen. My focus was on the person I had become through surviving his betrayal, stronger, more connected to community, and dedicated to helping others find their voices when faced with similar challenges. At 72 years old, I had discovered that it's never too late to reinvent yourself, to find new purpose, and to transform pain into power. Kristof had tried to steal my dignity along with my money, but dignity, I'd learned, can't be stolen, only surrendered, and I had refused to surrender mine. Standing in my garden that evening, surrounded by the herbs and flowers I'd successfully grown in containers on my small patio, I felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought me to this place. I'd lost a son but found myself. I'd lost my savings but gained a community. I'd lost my illusions but gained my voice. The woman who discovered that empty bank statement 2 years ago had been afraid, ashamed, and isolated. The woman I'd become was confident, connected, and committed to helping others navigate similar challenges. It had been a painful transformation, but it had been worth every difficult step along the way. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who had reclaimed her dignity through the simple act of refusing to remain silent. And that, I realized, was the most important victory of all. Up next, we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.